All right. So, hello, everybody. It is the 1st of August today. So, we have done the classes for 3 months, and now we're starting on the fourth month of this 1 year program. And this weekend, on the 6th at 11, we'll have our second herb walk. And if you want to come to that, that is going to be in the Kentucky River Palisades in the forest. So, it's a different type of plant community than what we saw before. And depending on what the weather's like and whether there's rain between now and then, there might be a lot of mushrooms. There'll at least be a lot of woodland species of plants to see and to learn about. And it should be a pretty nice hike, somewhat strenuous compared to the last one because it will be more hilly terrain. And possibly a longer walk. So keep that in mind. And if you can make it, that'll be great. If not, I'm going to try and live stream it as well, but I'm not sure that I will be able to because of just reception out in the woods. So yeah, so I was just saying Sunday the 6th at 11 a.m. at Tom Dorman, Kentucky River Palisades Nature Sanctuary. Be walking around looking at plants in a forest made out of plants. So hope that as many people as possible can make it to that. Today, for this week's topic, I want to be talking about supportive care. And exactly what I mean by supportive care is taking care of someone's health in a situation where you're not trying to treat or cure an illness, you're just trying to help the person through the process of illness. And that can be, towards recovery, or if it's a terminal illness, it can be helping them towards the end of their life. So this is kind of a category of healthcare that probably constitutes the majority of human healthcare activities, and that is largely overlooked in discussions of healthcare. So let's talk a little bit more about what I mean about that. But basically, when people are sick, much more often than they're admitted to a hospital or receive any sort of professional care or anything like that, they tend to receive care at home from people who are around them or from themselves. And this would be things like keeping someone warm and hydrated and giving them, things for pain and fevers and stuff like that while they get better from a common illness, for instance. If you ever were a child, hopefully you had somebody doing this for you. And if you ever were a parent, you've probably had to do the same thing for your children. So this is just a very common thing. The profession of nursing kind of came from the basic human activity of taking care of the sick. A lot of the time, up until Victorian times or so in the West, this was not really a profession at all. It was just something that people did. Often people from religious orders or members of the person's family would take care of a person who was sick, who was injured, or who was, infirm in such a way that they were no longer able to take care of themselves or had never been able to take care of themselves. And they would, provide supportive care for them. And eventually that became something that some people were specialized in, and that became the profession of nursing. And the word nurse has many meanings in English, but one of the meanings is just to take care of a sick person, nurse them to health, that sort of thing. And essentially, it's the word itself is very closely related to the word nourish. It's essentially like a different pronunciation or a different manifestation of the same root word. So you're nourishing a person, you're helping to make sure that they're fed, hydrated, and things like that, clean, and also at the same time providing remedies that might help them through whatever is going on with them. So if they're, needing help falling asleep, or if they're in pain, or if they have a fever, doing things for those sorts of situations that are kind of inherently self-limiting in the first place. So it's not like you're curing a disease or fixing something, you're just giving ease. You're helping a person through a difficult situation. And that's, different than trying to fix something, essentially. It's just trying, you have maybe a situation that's going to fix itself eventually. If somebody has, for example, a fever, a febrile illness, just like a common cold or a flu or something like that, most of the time, that's not going to turn into anything complicated. It's not going to be something where their life needs to be saved. It's just going to be something where they feel miserable, and you can help them to feel less miserable. And if you are someone who knows about herbal medicine, then this is a really big part of what you can do for the people around you to help them and to help their lives be better and to help your community be better, is to use your skills to provide supportive care in situations that are kind of would essentially be self-limiting anyway, and aren't necessarily situations where someone would need intensive care, like in a hospital type of setting, but also situations where they're much better off to have the supportive care, even though they would have lived without it. So that includes serious or moderate seriousnesses of illnesses, and it also includes injuries, and a lot of the time it also involves changes to the body from age and things like that. A lot of us get to a point where we live long enough where we're not as able to take care of ourselves as we used to be, and maybe need some help with that, and also remedies to help people in that type of situation. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm going to be talking about today. One second. So yeah, that time for the herb walk is 11 a.m. That's when we want to meet in the parking lot of the nature sanctuary, which is about half an hour or so south of Lexington on US 27. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less, depending on how fast traffic is moving. So as far as supportive care, it has a few key elements. Hydration and nutrition are often a big part of it. So hydration is pretty simple, mostly a matter of giving people fluids. Water, plain water is really great, is generally really acceptable to people. If somebody is in a situation where they're losing a lot of water through vomiting or diarrhea or something like that, sometimes it is helpful to add about a teaspoon of sugar and a quarter teaspoon of salt per 2 liters of water, or per half gallon of water. And that's just to help replace some of the electrolytes, some of the sodium in particular, and some calories that they would be losing. This is rehydration salts is the kind of name that this drink is usually called by. There are various commercial versions of it, like Gatorade or Pedialyte or something like that, that you can buy, but there's also just water with some salt and some glucose or some sugar, and it's simple enough to make. But if somebody is able to take food, you don't have to worry as much about adding the other parts in. So chicken soup is a traditional thing that a lot of people are familiar with as a food for people who are sick. And there are a few reasons why that works. It's not necessarily specifically to do with it being chicken, other than that chicken is a food animal that was readily available, has often been readily available, less expensive and that sort of thing, which isn't always true now. But for one thing, you have the hot liquid. Warm liquids can be really soothing to the body if there's a lot of tension, if there's pain, if there's tightness in the stomach, which there often is from nausea. Then warm liquids can sometimes feel better than cold liquids. Sometimes drinking something cold will just make it sit in the stomach and feel heavy. Whereas if it's closer to body temperature, it's not going to feel cold and heavy in the stomach. And it might be a little easier to keep it down. In addition to that, chicken soup often has some carbs in it in the form of potatoes or noodles or something like that, which is readily available calories, can easily be absorbed by the body. Salt, a little bit of fat, which again is a different type of readily available calories, and maybe a little bit of meat, which is protein as well. So there's a little bit of, nourishment, energy being put in, but it's not a heavy food. It's something that's already liquid, and it should be mostly stock, should be mostly broth if you're giving it to a sick person. And then in addition to that, it's really easy to add some herbs to chicken soup. If there's nausea and you want to add ginger, you can add ginger. If you want to add some thyme or some oregano to break up congestion, you can do that very easily. The flavor profile will accept a lot of different herbs that are, culinary herbs tend to be pretty powerful and very safe. So most of them will go okay in soup. So that's often why people have used soup as a food for the sick. Just, to be able to be rehydration, some nourishment, and a vehicle for getting some other herbs into a person's body. A lot of the time, teas are helpful too. One of the main things that people feel when they're sick, besides nausea and pain, one of the things that people feel a lot of the time is sort of an oppressive sense of fatigue. And the best thing for that, if possible, is sleep. Somebody who is sick and feels like they need to be asleep should be allowed to sleep pretty much as they want to, as much as is practically possible. Sometimes there might be, real life reasons why you can't, but if you can, then it's a really good idea to. But comfort wise, sometimes people are not able to sleep. They feel exhausted and yet unable to sleep. So sometimes black tea is helpful in that situation because it can perk people up a little bit, make them feel a little less oppressively exhausted, and maybe help them to do a little something with their body that might make them feel a little more able to fall asleep. So sometimes if somebody is able to be awake and move around a little bit, then go back to sleep, they get some more sound rest than if they were just, hadn't been out of bed much and were feeling restless. So sometimes a very mild, you don't want to like load somebody up with caffeine or anything, but a little bit can sometimes help people to feel better temporarily. So that's the fatigue. On the other side of that, sometimes giving people herbs that help them to sleep can help them get through a sickness and, pass the time resting until the sickness is gone, because a lot of the time that's what happens, is that people will feel better when they wake up, or feel, partly recovered when they wake up. And so being able to sleep is crucially important, and a lot goes into that, making someone physically comfortable. Sometimes it means propping them up. Sometimes it means making sure that they've had food and that sort of thing. Sometimes, though, relieving pain can be a really helpful thing. And then sometimes just sleep producing herbs like chamomile and lavender, which are also helpful to congestion, or in a more extreme case like skullcap, that would just help the person to find sleep and be able to rest so that their body can recover and so that they can, get closer to the time when they're going to feel better again. When I've sat with very sick people, a lot of the time, that's the thing that, a lot of people find really maddening is like, if I could just sleep, I feel like I could get better. If I could just sleep, I feel like I could feel better. And so helping that to happen can be really huge for people. I have had someone tell me that they felt like I saved their life because I gave them something that helped them sleep when they had been very ill and had not slept for a couple days. And they weren't in any actual obvious mortal danger health-wise, but the effect on the mind of being unable to sleep for a prolonged period of time is going to be very distressing. And so sometimes, being able to sleep is just feels like a really huge relief. Relieving pain is another big thing. Pain and fevers often go together, body aches and fevers. So when people have any kind of a febrile illness, which is a lot of common, colds, flus, COVID, Zika virus, whatever, a lot of these things involve fevers and pain. So being able to deal with those things together is really helpful. Violet syrup is something that I've used a lot in that type of a situation. And this is something that relieves fevers and relieves pain. Wintergreen tea is another one. Wintergreen is a forest herb here in Eastern North America. Probably it's possible to find it as a commercial herb, but it's never been a very common, well, I won't say never. In my lifetime, it has not been a very common commercial herb, but it's a very huge part of Eastern North American folk medicine, so Appalachian traditional medicine, and before that, various different types of Native American medicine that were in the same part of the country have used this plant, and it's good tasting, and it's also quickly fever and pain relieving. So that's something that I like a lot in that type of situation. In a slightly different way, ginger relieves pain and nausea, and if you take enough of it, it induces sweating. So making someone sweat is actually something you find in health traditions from all around the world as a way of breaking fevers and cooling the body down. It's not really much used. I can't think of any modern conventional medicines that are used for that purpose. Although quinine does do that, but there are a lot of different herbs that would be used. Dogwood bark is a traditional one in this part of the country. You take a strong tea of dogwood bark, it will make you sweat and it will help cool your body down, and often it will relieve aches and pains as well, and chills from fever. Bone set is another herb that is similar in its action and its history of use. And bone set is starting to bloom right now. So if you don't know this plant, it's a good one to know. And I will talk more about it at the end here. But it's a good plant for supportive care, especially in cases where there's high fever. Mulberries and elderberries are both things that I use as a medicine to help relieve fevers. Often when people take them for fevers, their fever will go up a little bit and then come down. And these plants contain a lot of antioxidants that relieve inflammation, and they also contain some things that are what you might call, well, the same antioxidants are also what can be called cytokine modulators, but they don't just suppress inflammation in the body, they change it a little bit so that it's targeted a little bit differently, but they will often relieve fevers. And because those are fruits and because they're sweet in their natural form, they can be cooked down into a syrupy type of consistency. And that syrup can be used, it's a really good remedy for children because it's very acceptable to them taste-wise, and it works quickly, and it's strong, but safe enough to use in a small person. With that, I mentioned that for elderberry and also for mulberry. Mulberries and elderberries are both purple fruits that grow on trees. Mulberries are shaped kind of like raspberries or blackberries, and they're a cluster of tiny little fruits. And then elderberries are just a single round fruit. Well, I mean, there are a bunch of them together on the plant, but each elderberry is a single fruit, whereas each mulberry is a cluster of fused together small globes of fruit. Hang on just a second. So relieving fevers, relieving pain, and making sure that somebody is hydrated and nourished are very important parts of supportive care. I mentioned nausea a little bit. That's often a symptom that people have to deal with in the course of supportive care for illnesses. So relieving nausea can be really huge for people. Relieving diarrhea is also often a part of the situation. And so there are a couple of different herbs that some of which we've talked about before that are helpful in each of those situations. It's also important to remember that those functions of the body are there for a reason. A lot of the time when somebody has diarrhea or when they have vomiting, it's their body trying to reject or get rid of something, trying to purge itself of a virus or of a toxic substance or something like that. So I don't think it's necessarily a good idea to just suppress those symptoms out of hand just because they're there. When you do suppress them, the aim should mostly be at keeping the person comfortable and keeping them from losing too much fluids, which is not a huge concern in adults. I mean, it can be. It can be. It's mostly a concern in babies and old folks because they're more fragile and they have less fluid in their bodies to lose in the first place. But even in them, a little bit of diarrhea or a little bit of vomiting is not necessarily anything to be alarmed about. It's just a natural reflex that the body uses to cleanse itself. But if it goes on too much, it can be really unpleasant for the person, and also it can be dehydrating. So rehydrating is important, especially if the person is able to keep down liquids. If they're not at all able to keep down liquids, sometimes, after an hour or two, it's often very helpful to do something about the nausea. and about the diarrhea. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what there is to do about those things. And how you might go about approaching those if you do decide that you need to suppress those functions, which, like I said, is not necessarily something you always want to do, but it's good to be able to, because they can be excessive and they can be uncomfortable. So with nausea, there are a few different approaches to it. One of them, ginger is a really common one. Sometimes ginger flavored fizzy drinks that have real ginger in them can be helpful. Some people find that the fizziness helps with nausea itself. Some people find the opposite. So, I kind of go with what the person feels on that. A strong tea made from ginger can be really helpful too. Like I said, it's warming, but the ginger, the heat of the liquid is warming, and that's helpful. And then the ginger is also increasing circulation to the area and decreasing the nausea, and that can be really helpful. So that is something that I've used countless times to help with nausea, and it's probably the first thing I usually use. I often will use a very concentrated ginger extract that's basically like juiced ginger, but with enough alcohol added to it to keep it preserved, so that it is a tincture, but it's a fresh ginger tincture with a lot of ginger in it. And the nice thing about that is that the person can take a smaller amount of it, because if you give them a liter of ginger tea, then that's a lot for them to keep down. But if you give them a dropper full or a teaspoonful of strongly concentrated ginger and then some water to wash that down with, then that's going to maybe be easier for them to hold down. Sometimes, you kind of have to take nausea on a case-by-case basis. But movement almost always makes nausea worse. So if a person is moving around, that's likely to make it worse. If they're being driven around, that's very likely to make it worse. So sometimes even just having their eyes open in a room where there's movement going on, or trying to watch TV or something like that, sometimes that will also trigger nausea. If person can't keep anything down by mouth, there's a pressure point that I like to use on both arms, just inside the elbow here. There's sort of a bony protuberance right here, and then just behind and above that, there's a little nerve point where the ulnar nerve is, I guess. And you can put some pressure on that. And sometimes when you first do that, if somebody's very nauseous, sometimes they will throw up immediately. But often, if you hold that point, it will help to relieve nausea. Sometimes it's more like it brings it to a head at first, but if you hold it, it tends to relieve it. So that's a point that I use either with pressure or with moxibustion, which is burning herbs near it, to help relieve nausea. And that's another thing that I very frequently use. Some people like to use cannabis for nausea. I don't recommend using that in someone who's not used to it. If somebody is already a user of cannabis and they, I want to smoke a joint because I'm nauseous, it will probably help them not to be nauseous. If you give it to somebody who isn't used to it, it's very likely to make them very uncomfortable and probably very nauseous as well, or can make the nausea worse as well. So don't think, oh, this person doesn't smoke, but right now they might need it. Usually that's not such a good idea, unless it's a chronic thing, and then they might be able to get used to it or something like that. But in terms of just being nauseous from a passing illness, the pro side of things is that it's a nausea remedy that you can take without having to swallow anything. The con side of it is that, it can make people feel in an altered state of mind that might be really uncomfortable or alarming to them. And some people get sick the first time that they use it if they're not used to it as well. So that's all stuff that bears some keeping in mind. Certainly not something that I have here at the clinic with me or anything like that. It is illegal in a lot of places and legal in some other places right now. So anyway, it's good to know about it, but it's also good to know about other stuff too, because it is not the one size fits all remedy for that sort of thing. So ginger is one that I use a lot. The pressure point is something I use a lot too. And then just trying to control the environment so that they're not seeing a lot of movement or moving around a lot can be really helpful as well. With diarrhea, I usually try to let it run its course and just keep hydrating the person. And with nausea, it can be hard for someone to keep hydrating if they can't keep water down. With diarrhea, the fact that it's running through them, as long as it's being replenished, is not as much of a concern. It can be really uncomfortable or really disruptive too, though. So it's important to know of some things that you can do to help someone in that situation. And generally speaking, there's multiple levels of severity as far as diarrhea goes. But for most of your run-of-the-mill situations, the first thing that I would do is to try and give the person some food that contains some soluble fiber, some food that's going to be kind of absorbent. Oats are a really good thing for this. Oats will soak up a lot of water. Cornmeal will too. If the person can eat something like grits or cereal that's made with cornmeal or something like that, that will soak up quite a bit of water. Most cereals will, breads and cereals will soak up quite a bit of fluid. So getting someone to eat something like that might slow the rate at which the fluids are coming through them, because if they're just eating things like meat and vegetables, there's not really anything there to absorb the liquid in the intestines. So it just kind of washes through and you get maybe liquid with some solid pieces in there. But if you have something with soluble fiber, then you get more of a solid mass. So trying to get more soluble fiber into the person is helpful if they have any appetite at all. I really don't like forcing food on people who don't have much of an appetite. Sometimes, especially if it's just for a day or two, it's not going to gravely harm them to not eat if they don't feel like they have an appetite. So I'm pretty much okay with that. A lot of people will feel really weak after not eating for a day or two, but they will regain that once they feel well enough to start eating again. But if they do have an appetite, then trying to get some food in them with some soluble fiber, something that will absorb water and turn it into more of a viscous fluid instead of just rushing right through them. So oats, rice, pretty much any kind of grain or cereal is going to help with that. Seaweed also helps with that. It's not something that we eat as much around here. We're far from the sea, but it is a traditional food that a lot of people eat, and that will help in that type of situation. So those kinds of foods are helpful. In addition to that, astringent herbs can be helpful. Things like black walnut or oak bark, taken in very small amounts, can sometimes help to decrease the amount of fluid that's being poured into the digestive tract, into the intestines. and that can slow the rate at which things are rushing through people. So all of that is helpful. And then actually muscle calming herbs, like chamomile or skullcap might help as well, because there's often a lot of cramping that goes on when people have that very bad diarrhea from an illness. Just a second. Mm. A lot of the time, if I'm going to give somebody something for diarrhea other than hydration and soluble fiber, I will use black walnut and use 1 milliliter at a time at intervals of about 20 minutes or so. And a lot of the time, if you give somebody some black walnut and then 20 minutes later, you give them a little bit more, 20 minutes later, you give them a little bit more. After 3 or 4 times, a lot of the time that slows things down to the point where they're no longer having diarrhea. There are some stronger herbs like poppies that will really shut down and slow down peristalsis. But that's really, if you're at that point, then it's not really a do-it-yourself project anymore. It's kind of like time to call in somebody with a higher skill level and get some help with it. But there are herbs that can help with essentially slowing that down by making the muscles around the digestive tract sort of sleep, making it so that they're no longer contracting and pushing things through. Skullcap will help with that some, and it's like a really mild herb, but more severe, more intense herbs, like California poppy or wood poppy or something like that will also help with that, but should really probably not be used at the experience level that you're at right now. But they are something, there are, options like that can be used. Also, sometimes soaking in hot water, taking a hot bath, sometimes really helps to slow down the rate at which peristalsis is working, the movement along the digestive tract is working, just by relaxing the whole body. So that's something that can help with that as well. But like I said, mainly what you want to do with both vomiting and diarrhea is keep the person hydrated and let it run its course as much as you can. So with most of these remedies, most of these interventions, the focus is really on giving ease and helping the person to feel more comfortable, more so than trying to fix something that would otherwise be a dangerous situation. Because for the most part, in the vast majority of scenarios, these things aren't dangerous situations. They're just kind of normal functions of the human body when it encounters an unusual situation, when it encounters a pathogen, food poisoning, something like that. So knowing how much to intervene and how hard to intervene versus how much to let things run their course is kind of partly a matter of personal preference, partly something that you just gain with experience. And I think in former times, caring for the sick was just sort of like a basic domestic skill, something like sewing or churning butter or whatever. That was just something that people knew how to do for themselves. And much like sewing and churning butter, a lot of people pay somebody else to do that now. They don't really have that kind of self-reliance or that kind of domestic skills anymore as much. And especially especially as we've come into industrial times with nuclear families or smaller household units, there's much less likely to be someone who is able to be dedicated to helping sick people in the family. You know, everybody has their job or their school or something like that, and maybe you have a household that's just 2 generations instead of where, a few generations before there might have been 3 or 4 generations living in one household, and it might have included some older people that were more experienced with taking care of sick people and stuff like that. So, it's something that has become more commodified and professionalized rather than just being a basic part of life, a basic life skill. So I really feel like it's important to keep it as a basic life skill and to practice it as such, because it's because you're always there when you need yourself, and you've got hopefully some other people around you that are there when you need them too. So this is kind of a core skill in a community, but not necessarily in most cases a skill that people are doing professionally, except in the case of nursing or something like that, which is more of a regulated and licensed profession, and so it's kind of a little bit different. But a lot of the time, formerly, this would have been someone's role in the community. You would have had somebody who was just not even necessarily a professional herbalist, but maybe a person who particularly knew how to do this. Maybe a grandmother or a priest or someone like that who was just known for being able to do this kind of thing. So I'm trying to pass some of that tradition on to all of you, and have you understand both the importance and the basic skills of providing supportive care to people. Another area where supportive care really comes into play, and still does in our modern society a lot of the time, is in these scenarios I was talking about before, is more like self-limiting types of situations where the person is either going to get better after you take care of them, or they're going to die after you take care of them because they're terminally ill or dying and you're taking care of them. But there are also situations where people need supportive care after something serious, after they've passed through a serious crisis and are no longer in need of any sort of intensive care, but are not back to normal either. So that's a big category that people can fall into, where, for instance, someone might, like, let's say somebody's been severely injured and maybe spent some time in the hospital, and then they come home and they're well enough to be home, but not really well enough to do everything for themselves yet. That might be a situation in which someone would need supportive care as well. And a lot of the time in that situation, it would be less focused on let's see, how do I want to phrase it? Less focused on an intervention for something that is immediate, and more focused on recovery, more focused on regaining ability, sometimes more focused on relearning or re-practicing skills that they had before. So for instance, being able to walk around the house, for instance, might be something that somebody needs some help with at first. I have a family member who had a stroke, and afterwards, was for quite a while not as able to get around, and not necessarily as able to um, not always is able to think clearly and speak clearly and things like that as they had been before. And that situation lasted for over a year before they were like really, they kind of got to the point where they were pretty much recovered from it, but it took a long time. And that sort of situation is common. That sort of thing is pretty common. So if you have something like that that you're working with, that you're intervening with, then it's really important to help the person, to make sure that the person is not getting worse because of the problems that they already have. So for instance, that they're able to access nutritious food rather than just crappy convenience food, even though they're not necessarily as able to do the food preparation themselves, for instance. That's not a very glamorous part of taking care of people compared to, giving them a remedy for something dramatic that then gets better and they're like, wow, that really helped me. In fact, it's much more frustrating, but it is also a real life scenario that a lot of people have to deal with. So it's good to know how to deal with it. And one of the things that is most important in that situation is having proper nourishment, having good sleep, having a good sleep situation, and also exercising in an incremental way so that they're like not doing a whole lot more than they're used to, but always doing a little bit more than they're used to as a way of building stamina and regaining abilities. And that can be a long process. And, of course, there are people who are professionals in physical therapy and occupational therapy and things like that, who are going to be much more knowledgeable about the whole process and exactly what they can do. But being someone who is present and being someone who is able to be with the person is often more important than having the expertise. So if you are able to know some about the situation and you're able to be there, that's more important than, or more impactful than knowing a lot but not being able to be there except an hour a week or something like that. So it's important to, if you're in that situation, educate yourself about the specifics of whatever the person's situation is that you're dealing with, because it might be different for different conditions. And then being patient with the other person while they're healing is really important. Being patient with the person who is healing is a huge challenge in supportive care. And I think that people often don't realize it when they're going into it. A lot of the time people take on a supportive care role without really, they don't necessarily feel like they have a choice in the matter. They're like, okay, my significant other had a stroke. Now I'm the one who has to take care of them. And they don't know what they're getting into. And then they, have to deal with it. And it can be a lot. And so, recognizing ahead of time that it is going to be a lot is probably really helpful. And then, learning about the specifics of whatever their situation is really important. And then just trying to be present is really important too. So that has a lot to do with what I think of as being the ethics of being a healer, or the philosophy of being a healer, is that, to me, a lot of the time, showing up is the most important thing you can do. And that sometimes your abilities, your knowledge level, and that sort of thing doesn't matter as much as, and is generally speaking secondary to, your willingness to show up and your the work that you put into it, your intention and your work that you put into the situation. So a lot of the time, supportive care is a lot of work, and sometimes it's more about work than it is about knowledge and skills. I can't really give you the work part of it, but I can do what I can to give you the knowledge and skills part of it. So that's why I'm talking about that. But really, it's also important to know that it is more about being there for the grind than it is about the specialized knowledge and skills. All that being said, there are a lot of herbs out there that are helpful for someone who is recovering from a long illness. We would often call these alteratives. Sometimes people have used the term tonics. Adaptogens is a modern term that kind of refers to the same thing, but these are herbs that help to make minor changes in a person's metabolism and in the way their body's using energy and things like that in a way that helps to regain strength and stamina. And so there are a lot of herbs out there that have this history of being used as nourishing tonics for people who have been through a long illness or for people who are in some sort of recovery state. So here in Kentucky, ginseng is a really well-known one. And ginseng is something that has complex pharmacology, which I'll probably get into at a later date, but essentially it decreases all sorts of inflammation, promotes energy, and promotes feelings of well-being. So often when people have had an illness or an injury, they have more inflammation in their body and they have less energy. Often they have less appetite. Ginseng will often help with appetite as well. So it's in there working on the endocrine system, and the endocrine system kind of helps to run everything else. So it's doing a lot of just sort of making minor adjustments to your physiology and how your body is metabolizing and handling energy. Sassafras is another plant that has the same kind of history. It tends to make people feel a little better if somebody's feeling run down and under the weather. Sometimes sassafras tea can feel uplifting to them. It also decreases inflammation, and it also helps move the lymph in the body. Lymph is a fluid that is in your tissues and that helps to move cells that are part of the immune response around, and among other things. And so helping to move the lymph fluid and decrease inflammation and decrease swelling can often make a person feel a lot better. So those are a couple of examples of herbs that have traditionally been used to help people recover from long illnesses or from injuries, and that are essentially beneficial in supportive care in those types of situations. Aurelia or spikenard is another local plant that is used in a similar way. It's kind of related to ginseng, but it's a little bit different in terms of how it works. It's a little bit less stimulating and more gentle, and works over a longer time frame, but might be better for somebody who feels too agitated if they take ginseng. So sometimes ginseng can feel overstimulating to people. So it's kind of like a light version of ginseng. So that's just kind of a general introduction to supportive care. Like I said, this is one of the more common types of healthcare activity in the human world. There's a very good chance that at some point in your life, if you haven't already, that you will have to do some kind of supportive care for older or younger family members. And sometimes people find themselves doing this sort of thing on a long-term basis without ever having expected to. It's a good professional skill for a healer to have, and it is also a really good basic life skill for a living person to have. Well, any questions about supportive care before I go on to talking a little bit about specific herbs? All right, hang on just a minute. All right, so the first one I want to talk about today is elder. This is some elderberry extract that I have here. And this is, let's see. I don't know if you can really tell it through the glass, but when I open it, it starts fizzing. So this one is kind of effervescent because it is actively fermenting. But this is basically just the partially fermented juice of elderberries. And the plant itself, elder, is a small tree. Sometimes people call it a bush. Sometimes people call it a small tree. I don't really know the difference between a bush and a tree, other than the trees have trunks. Bushes don't necessarily. But it's basically a small tree. It has hollow stems. It tends to be kind of weed-like in terms of growing in hedgerows and roadsides and things like that. It has tiny berries that are smaller than a pea and that birds eat, and birds distribute the seeds far and wide. And so it grows in lots of places. All sorts of different parts of the elderberry are used medicinally, of the elderberry plant. So the flowers, the berries, and the bark especially are pretty widely used medicinally. The berries are the most common thing that you would find in a modern herbal medicine if you were to go to a vitamin store or something like that. So let's see. I want to talk about the bark first because the bark is kind of the most neglected part. The bark peels off really easily, especially if you pick it before it flowers. The bark you can peel the bark off with your fingernail. You don't even need a knife or anything like that. And usually if I'm going to harvest elderberry bark, I will cut down either a whole tree or a whole branch and peel all the bark off of that. Elderberry bark is a pretty powerful laxative. It has some alkaloids in it that get into the large intestine and break apart into smaller substances, which irritate the lining of the large intestine and cause pretty strong bowel movements. So it's something, that type of laxative, people call a stimulant laxative. It's not stimulant in the sense that like coffee or cocaine or something would be a stimulant. It's just stimulating the lining of the intestine. And those types of laxatives are only for occasional use. You wouldn't want to use them on a daily basis, or you would get a situation where a person was not able to have a bowel movement without them. So usually I would only use something like that for constipation that's been going on for a while that maybe hasn't responded to some other attempts to treat it. Hang on just a second. All right. So, yeah, mostly something I would only use if somebody had been constipated for a few days. Uh, and usually, even then, I would try other things first. But does tend to be pretty strongly moving to the bowels. Not as strong as some other laxatives like aloe latex or buckthorn or cascara, but stronger than senna. So kind of, I don't know, medium to strong type of laxative. And that's what I would use the bark for. The flowers are very mildly laxative. They've got some of the same stuff in them, but not very much. And they promote digestion and appetite. So a traditional preparation of them is elderflower cordial, which is where they're soaked in some liquor with some usually with some sweetener, syrup or something added. But that's something that would be taken before a meal to promote digestion and appetite. Elderflower also can be used a little bit for fever. So it mildly induces sweating and can help to reduce fever. So it kind of has some of the characteristics of the bark, some of the characteristics of the fruit, but the flavor is its own thing. It's also a little bit calming, soothing to the nerves. The berry is the part that I use the most medicinally. Now, some people say that if they eat the berry raw, it makes them feel very sick. I've never experienced this personally, but there are some what are called cyanogenic glycosides in the seed, which are slightly poisonous substances in the seed, similar to what would be in the pit of a cherry or a peach. And like I said, I've never had any trouble with them, but some people feel nauseous if they eat them raw. But that stuff goes away when it's cooked. So a lot of the time, elderberries are prepared by crushing and cooking the berries to remove the juice from them. You can actually put them in a double boiler and kind of mash them up and just let the double boiler do its work, and the juice will come out of the berries, and you can pour that off. And that's one way that I sometimes prepare them. Mostly I prepare them by putting them in a really big pot, mashing them up with a big wooden mashing thing, and stirring them around until the seeds come out. Let's see if I have a picture of something like that. I do not. Okay, so once it is made into a juice, that juice can be fermented and made into wine. It can be kept as juice if it's refrigerated or if it's canned, but it has a very short shelf life once it's opened. So you can make it into wine very easily. It lends itself very well to fermenting and making the alcohol to preserve itself. So that's often how I use it, is I make a wine out of it. I've also made tincture out of the berries by soaking them in alcohol. During when the pandemic started, well, let's see. For years and years before the pandemic started, I had been using elderberries along with usnea and lemon balm for viral illnesses as something that people could take to help to shorten the severity and duration of viral illnesses that they might come in contact with. So every year during flu season, I would make up a big batch of that and give it out to people, give it out or sell it to people. And then when the pandemic started, I had some but not as much as I wish I had. So, and then it was a few months later that there were actual elderberries that could be harvested, and I harvested a lot of them. But in the early days of the pandemic, the early months of the pandemic, I was making gallons upon gallons of extract using elder and also usnea and lemon balm, two other immune supporting and antiviral herbs, and selling that to people and giving it to people who couldn't afford to buy it, and just kind of trying to get it into the hands of as many people as wanted it, which was an interesting process, something different than something on a different scale than anything I'd done before, as far as trying to, get large amounts of medicine out to large amounts of people. Um, but elder is really helpful for making illnesses that people get, just like common colds, flu, COVID, anything like that, really, to basically be a little bit shorter and a little bit less severe. Often people in studies where they've used elderberry-based products get better on average a day earlier. So, instead of being sick for 3 days, they'll be sick for 2, something like that. So, it's not necessarily a miracle cure, but it is definitely a big help, a material help in terms of people having less severe and less long lasting illnesses. And in the short term, it often will, if you give somebody an elderberry based product while they have a fever, sometimes it will go up a degree or so for about an hour, and then the fever will start to come down. So that's something that sometimes people find alarming, because, oh no, it's making things worse. It's not really making things worse. It's making things run their course a little bit faster. But sometimes, it does turn up the heat a little bit for a short period of time, but it usually doesn't make people feel worse. So personally, I'm less concerned about the number on the thermometer and more concerned about how the person feels. So elderberry kind of helps kick the immune system into high gear a little bit for a little while, and then people start to feel better. There was sort of a scare that went around in 2020 that elderberry could cause a cytokine storm. A cytokine storm is a sort of thing, sort of a runaway inflammatory process that can happen when somebody is in the end stages of pneumonia. And I think that someone read that elderberry had an effect on cytokines, and then maybe didn't really understand what they were reading, and wrote a blog post about it that suggested that it would perhaps trigger a cytokine storm. So a lot of people avoided elderberry, but in fact, in my experience, which was well over 1,000 people, probably closer to 2,000 people that I gave elderberry to and observed the effects of afterwards, it was actually very helpful. So, it's kind of like the process of speculating about things that could go wrong often kind of keeps people from the reality of what might actually be going right with some remedies. So yeah, elderberry, it takes quite a lot of elderberries to make a decent amount of elderberry juice, but it's I think it's worth the trouble. Elderberries are getting ripe right now. Some of them actually are ripe right now. Some of them have been eaten by birds, and some of them are still unripe. But if you know where any grows, now is a good time to check on them. As good a time as any. Last week was probably an even better time, but elderberry, when you find it growing, it grows in sort of a umbrella shaped cluster. The cluster is kind of from the outside or from the top looks similar to the types of clusters of flowers on Queen Anne's lace are on poison hemlock, but it's on a very different sort of plant. And of course, it turns into these purple berries that people have used for medicine for a very, very long time, and that have been, medicine and food and beverage for people since before written records. I think that the name elder itself, it sounds like the word elder meaning someone who's older, someone or something who is older. I think originally it was just a name of a tree, something sort of like alder, that didn't necessarily mean that. But in medieval times, in Middle English, when people said the word berry without otherwise specifying it, it meant grapes, which originally grapes didn't grow where people spoke English, and not until people started planting them. They're not really native to northern Germany or to England. Northern Germany is where the Saxons came from, and England's where it became, the English language. So I think that when people started growing grapes and calling them berries, they referred to this previous plant that they had been making wine out of before that as elderberries. So that it was partly the name. They kind of came up with what's called a folk etymology, a different origin of the word that wasn't originally what the tree name meant. So it was something that sounded kind of like elder, but then they started calling them elderberries as though they were the previous form of berry before grapes came around, the previous thing that people used to make an alcoholic beverage out of. Not that they ever stopped making an alcoholic beverage out of it. But anyway, there will be, if you come to the cookout in August, there will be some elderberry wine there if anybody wants to try it. And if you have elderberries growing near you, now might be a good time to pick them, depending on where you live. Here in Kentucky, we have a different type of elderberry than what people have on the West Coast. So they have a more pale blue or waxy coated that makes them look pale blue elderberry, and we have a dark purple elderberry here. There are also some red ones in other places, but the dark purple ones are the main ones that have been studied and used as medicine, and that there's more written records of and more research about, because there's a particular elderberry product, Sambucol is the name of it, that has had, the people who make it have done a lot of small clinical trials on it as part of their promotion of it, so being able to say, oh, we gave this to a certain amount of people and it performed this way in a clinical trial is very persuasive to people. So they've put a lot of money and a lot of energy into making some trials like that about elderberry. So those exist when they wouldn't otherwise. And there's also, written history of elderflower and elderberry being used for a very long time. The other herb that I want to talk about today is boneset. Boneset is Eupatorium perfoliatum. Perfoliatum means, or perfoliate means that the leaf wraps around the stem. So it kind of gives the appearance of the stem coming up through the middle of the leaf. But, basically the leaf comes out on either side of the stem and they join around the stem. And it has a white cluster of flowers at the top of it. And the flowers and leaves are the main parts used medicinally. Boneset is extremely bitter. And it's, let's see. It's a very bitter herb, and it also induces sweating and helps to break fevers. So back in the 1700s, there was an outbreak of a febrile illness that people called breakbone fever. And it was probably a mosquito-borne fever, something along the lines of yellow fever or Zika or something like that. But it was a fever that was characterized by very strong muscle spasms, chills, febrile seizures, and they called it breakbone fever because of how much it made people tense up. And so boneset was actually named in English around that time as a result of its effect on breakbone fever, rather than its tradition of being used to set bones, which it actually has been used for, according to some ethnobotany of native tribes here. But it's a native species to the United States. It grows in meadow and grassland type habitats. Tends to be a fairly tall plant, 4 feet tall or so, and has white flowers and dark green leaves. And like I said, a distinctive arrangement of leaves that are opposite each other on opposite sides of the stem and wrapping around the stem, so that it gives the appearance of the stem coming up through the middle of a leaf. And so this was Benjamin Rush was the physician who wrote about its use during the breakbone fever. And it's something that has been used a lot, before that and since then, as a thing for fevers. So it's kind of similar in a way to quinine. It contains some quinolones that are alkaloids, which induce sweating and decrease fever, and probably also have some antibacterial and antiparasitic properties that help with some types of illness. So, it actually will cause somebody to break out in a pretty profuse sweat if they have a fever when they take it. And so a lot of the time, at that time, what people were doing was having people drink large amounts of it and wrap up in blankets and things like that, sit by the fire, anything to help them sweat. And when people start sweating, not only does the sweat start cooling the body by physically removing heat, but there are actually metabolic changes that go on as you're sweating that change how fluids are moving in your body, and that can result in decreasing fevers and increasing adrenaline and cortisone and other things in your body in a way that makes people feel better. So a lot of natural healing traditions involve inducing sweating through herbs like this, but also through physical means like sweat lodges or saunas, or sweat houses. It's called Chach Alish in Irish. Sauna is the Finnish version of it. Sweat lodge is the English name for the Lakota version of it. So a lot of different traditions have these types of things where they're physically inducing sweating through heat. And then herbs that induce sweating are pretty common as well. Sudorifics, So these things can be used to help clear the skin. If somebody has problematic skin that has a lot of inflammation, sometimes inducing sweating will actually help. A lot of the time people are hesitant to try that because just getting out in the sun and sweating sometimes makes it worse. But sometimes taking herbs that induce sweating and have this cooling effect on the skin can make it better. So bone set falls into that category. It also does appear to promote healing of bones and other injuries, especially when used as a poultice. That is a trait or an ability that it shares with the herb comfrey, tradition of use. They've both been used for that situation to help get bones to heal themselves. And they both contain some potentially problematic substances, which are called pyrrolizidine alkaloids. And pyrrolizidine alkaloids are a very large category of chemicals. There are a whole bunch of different ones, and some of them are toxic and some of them are not. But the ones that are toxic may cause liver damage if they're used long term. So bone set is not something that should be used as like a remedy on a daily basis or anything like that. It's something that should be used very occasionally if there's high fever, to try and get that to resolve. And that can also be used topically for helping injuries to heal themselves. And when it's used topically, there's probably very little chance of any sort of systemic toxicity from it being applied topically as a poultice or something like that. So bone set is another herb that you could gather right around now. It's a good one to look up and maybe look for. It's not super common, but not super rare either here in central Kentucky. And like I said, it's something you find in meadows. So in like pasture land that hasn't been grazed for a couple years, or cropland that hasn't been planted for a few years, that's often where you'll find it. Places with tall grass and taller flowers. So it's a good herb to know about. It's not something you would use on all the time or a daily basis, but something that can be good to keep around for very occasional use. Hang on just a minute. Okay, so in summary, supportive care mostly consists of giving ease and helping to support structures and functions of somebody's body that are helping them to get through a particular period of illness or recovery. And it's a huge part of how people take care of each other in terms of their health. And it's something that, as a serious student of herbal medicine, you should be prepared to practice and self-educate on, and know what to do about. And for the most part, it involves a lot of patience and a lot of waiting and a lot of facilitating, and then trying to give ease, trying to keep people comfortable. And elderberry and boneset are both herbs that can be helpful in those processes, especially in terms of helping people through illnesses that involve fevers, which are very common. And also, both of them are harvestable right now, at least in my area, and possibly where you are as well. And they are generally found in margins and waste places and formerly settled areas, rather than in the deep woods. So any questions about supportive care or about either of the herbs? All right. So this weekend, like I said, Sunday at 11 o'clock, we'll be meeting in the parking lot of Tom Dorman Nature Sanctuary. And the way you get there is you take 27 south from Lexington through Jessamine County, and then you will cross the river, and immediately after crossing the river, it's on your right. And it's just, it looks like just a 1 block long dead end road. And you just kind of park in that little section of road. There's a gate at the end of it. So you just park in that little section of road, and then we will hike up through about 1/4 mile of area that's full of gravel and stuff that people have put down, and that will take us to the actual trail in the woods. And then the trail in the woods, we can do a longer or shorter version of it depending on what people feel up for. But there are a couple of different microhabitats that we can see there. There is the hillsides, and then there's the ridge top. And the hillsides are one type of woods, the ridge top are a slightly different type of woods. And then if we go down the other side of the ridge, we can eventually get to bottomlands along the river, the riparian environment, which is another type of habitat. And within those, we'll see different things like, different things depending on what the terrain is, different stands of plants, but it's woodland plants. And so, for instance, in the hillside area, you might see more red cedars. And when you get up onto the ridge top, it's going to be more like nut trees, like oaks and hickories. And then when you get down into the bottomlands, there's going to be things like spice bush and nettles, jewelweed, whole lot of different things. So there will also be in there some woodland root plants like bloodroot and yellow root, golden seal, probably black cohosh. All of that is going to be stuff that is around in this area. So if you get a chance to come, you get to see some really plants that have really strong medicinal traditions in this part of the country. And also, I think it's a really nice, really like the area. I think it's beautiful, and it's a pretty dramatic landscape once you get to once you hike through a certain point, you get to see karst topography, which is where limestone bedrock is very close to the soil. I mean, close to the surface, under not much topsoil, and then you get to see the cliff sides and things like that, and then the silt at the bottom. So it's a really good example of how different kinds of rocks give rise to different kinds of dirt, which give rise to different kinds of plants and different medicines. So it's a really great place to see the connection between the earth itself and the medicines that are being produced, and how different types of land produce different types of healing, different types of medicines. So I hope that I get a chance to share that with you, and that you can make it to see that sort of thing for yourself. If you come, be advised that it is the woods. There are ticks and snakes and mosquitoes and other things like that. And also it will be a hot day. So, try and be prepared for both the weather, which is likely to be sunny and hot and require additional hydration, as well as the forest itself, which, is a beautiful and generally hospitable place, but it does involve ticks, poison ivy, and various other challenges of that sort. We probably won't see any venomous snakes or anything. I've never seen any out there, but they're there. You just, it's not crawling with them or anything like that. But, it's outside and they live outside, so we could see them. They tend to kind of stay in the shade and underground and stuff like that when it's really hot out anyway. But anyway, if you get a chance to come, it's a really good chance to connect with the plants and the land and the connection between them. So hopefully some of you will be able to make it. All right then. So any questions about any of that? All right. And hopefully you're all working on your plant collections and stuff like that. So I look forward to getting a chance to see some of those whenever you're ready to show them to me. All right. Well, if anybody has any questions between now and Sunday, let me know, and I will try and send out a reminder as well before the weekend with some stuff in writing about getting to the place. And if you are coming and would like to bring someone with you, feel free to bring someone with you, bring a friend or whatever. And hope to see you there. All right. Well, thanks everybody, and I will talk to you again soon.